Around 1200 BC, the gates of Hattusa fell silent. An empire that signed the earliest known peace treaties simply vanished. How does a state so organized collapse so fast? The clues survive in clay and stone. To find answers, we return to the Anatolian plateau more than 3,500 years ago. Here, a highland kingdom grew into a great power whose capital, Hattusa, still sprawls in walls and temples above Bogazkoy. This was no provincial court. Its archives, thousands of clay tablets, recorded royal campaigns, law, ritual, and foreign policy. The modern story begins in 1906, when Hugo Winkler uncovered those tablets. In 1915, Bedřich Rosny recognized the language as Indo-European. That single step rewired how scholars map ancient migrations and relationships among languages. Hittite turned from a biblical footnote into a primary voice. On the late Bronze Age stage, this voice spoke with Egypt, Mitanni, and Assyria. Around 1274 BC, Muwatalli II faced Ramesses II at Qadesh. Under Hattusili III, the two courts sealed relations with a written peace, often cited as the oldest such treaty to survive. Yet the empire's end, around 1200 BC, is abrupt. Egyptian and Ugaritic records evoke seaborne attackers. Hittite letters from the final reigns mention famine. Archaeometry, from pollen to tree rings, indicates climate shifts. The evidence is rich but discontinuous, sovereign but biased. How, then, did a state so sophisticated fail so quickly? We will follow the trail from the first kings who made Hattusa a capital to the laws that tried to tame succession. We will see how diplomacy and war balanced, how religion and rule fused, and why a treaty could not save a system already tense. Then we will test the collapse against the strongest evidence now at hand, and track what survived after the fall. The ground at Bogazkoy gives up secrets by layers. Imagine the moment a worker's trowel exposes a brick of clay impressed with narrow wedges. A palace archive returns to air after 3 millennia. Dates and names step out of the dust. Those names include Labarn I, remembered as an origin point, and Hattusili I, who shifted the capital to Hattusa and fortified it. He pushed south, campaigning toward Alalak, and styled himself Great King. The image is clear. A court that marches, a king who builds, a state that claims long horizons. Then comes Mursili I. His army strikes around 1595 BC, ending the first Amorite dynasty. The raid is brief but symbolic. A Hittite reach now touches Mesopotamia. Yet that arc is jagged. Mursili I dies by assassination. What follows is faction, a stretch that later texts recall as dark and unstable. The Telepinu Proclamation tries to bind the wound. Around the mid-16th century BC, Telepinu issues a document that codifies the succession and sets limits meant to curb noble violence. It reads like both law and therapy, a king lecturing a realm into order. In it, the early empire shows its paradox. It can write rules that endure, yet it is forced to write them because rules keep breaking. By the time the Middle and Great Empire phases arrive, the Hittite state feels restored, but the last paragraph of this beginning leaves a question hanging. If succession needed a proclamation, how durable was the peace that followed? At the heart of Hittite rule sits a fused throne. The king is both priest and warrior. He commands armies and leads festivals. He dispatches troops and pours libations. That dual role is not literary flourish. It is embedded in ritual texts and royal annals preserved at Hattusa. Early on, a noble assembly known as the Pankas appears, a forum with a voice in judging and, at times, succession. Later records lean more heavily toward the crown, but the memory of shared judgment lingers in the way authority is written down. The state is personal and procedural at once. Administering outward, Hittite kings knit a belt of vassal kingdoms. Treaties fix loyalty, tribute, and mutual defense. They are pragmatic documents. They name places and obligations. In the late Bronze world, they function like guardrails on chaotic roads. War remains the measure between great courts. Around 1274 BC, Muwatalli II confronts Ramesses II near Qadesh on the Atlantis. Egyptian reliefs lionize Ramesses. Hittite texts emphasize their own strategy. Neither side concedes victory. The truth is in what follows. Under Hattusili III, The two empires sign a peace around 1259 BC. Copies survive in Egyptian and Hittite versions, the latter using Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca. The tablets speak of extradition, mutual aid, and dynastic amity. They even refer to metal copies, silver or bronze, though none have been found. Inside the empire, the pen is as busy as the spear. The laws preserve case patterns on property, injury, and penalty. Administrative lists track personnel and offerings. Ritual texts detail purification and foundation rites. Myth cycles, like the stories of Uluyanka and Kumarbi, are copied and recopied. The religious landscape folds local Anatolian gods into a larger pantheon. Yazılikaya, a rock sanctuary near Hattusa, carves that world into stone, with a procession of deities and an image of royal presence among them. We also have diaries of strain. The annals of Mursili II recount campaigns and a plague that ravaged the land. The king prays, legislates, and fights while disease gnaws. This is a system that documents its troubles, which is exactly why we can chart them. So by the late 13th century BC, the Hittite state looks both ironclad and adaptive. It binds vassals by text, fights until it can write peace with Egypt, and inscribes order into law and right. On the surface, the arrangement seems stable. A viewer might think the worst dangers are contained, the rules refined, the borders balanced. But a deep look at the sources introduces friction. Most Hittite texts are royal. They present policies with calm rationale and surround kings with ritual virtue. This is not deceit in a modern sense. It is how ancient courts write. Yet it narrows our field of view. The voice of a village hid by shortage, a vassal bruised by tax, a troop exhausted by a long march, seldom speaks unfiltered. Language adds another layer. The corpus is multilingual. Hittite dominates, but Akkadian serves diplomacy, and Luwian, Palaic, Hurrian, and Hattic appear. Translation is work, not certainty. Nuance in terms, legal formulas, and ritual rubrics can shift interpretation. Scholars have refined readings for a century, but gaps remain where a broken edge or an idiom blurs intent. Then the physical timeline complicates a neat narrative. Archaeometry suggests environmental stress near the turn of the 12th century BC. Pollen profiles and tree rings point to drier conditions, yet destruction levels are uniform, and the weight of climate varies region by region. Coastal devastation is well documented in Anatolia, while inland collapses carry a different signature. Finally, disappearance is not oblivion. After 1200 BC, the center at Hattusa is gone, but Neo-Hittite and Aramaean states in southeast Anatolia and northern Syria continue local lineages. They write Luwian hieroglyphs on basalt. Carchemish, Malatya, and Zincirli remain active hubs. The imperial form fails. The cultural fabric does not. A single cause murder mystery no longer fits. We're facing a complex failure in stages, with a long afterglow. Pressures spike in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Egyptian and Ugaritic texts attest to seaborne raiders that later literature calls the Sea Peoples. Whatever their precise makeup, they batter coastlines, cut routes, and upend ports that fed inland networks. Inside the Hittite system, letters from the last reign, under Suppiluliuma II, speak of famine. That is not a metaphor, it is a plea embedded in correspondence. Shortage weakens loyalty, vassals calculate risk. Rebellions cost troops and grain that had no surplus to spare. Trade fracture adds to the load. The late Bronze economy ran on long lines. When coastal nodes burn, caravans stall. When caravans stall, palace rations shrink. An archive can cajole, but it cannot conjure food. Then something final breaks. Around 1200 BC, Hattusa is destroyed and abandoned. The scribes stop. The royal voice cuts off mid-sentence. It is a hard boundary for historians. Beyond it, we follow other trails. Yet power does not vanish everywhere. In the south and east, Neo-Hittite and Aramaean polities take the stage. They use Luwian hieroglyphs, keep elements of iconography, and continue regional influence. Carchemish holds on. Malatya and Zincirli erect carved orthostats and stelae. The gray turns to black at the center, but the edges remain lit. We have reached the threshold question raised at the start. What made a strong empire fall so quickly that its own archives fell silent? The answer is not a single invader or a lone bad harvest. It is a synchronized crisis that crossed a limit the Hittite state could not manage. The Telepinu Proclamation shows a structural fault in succession that never fully healed. The annals of Mursili II record how disease can sap a realm even in high times. Egyptian and Ugaritic texts mark waves of attackers at sea that strained the region's trade and security. Letters from the last king refer to famine, which is exactly the kind of shock that turns vassal treaties into brittle parchment. Pollen and tree rings point to environmental stress that tightened every screw at once. Put these pieces together and the contradiction in the hook results. A state organized enough to write the earliest known peace treaty was also networked enough to fail everywhere when its networks failed somewhere. When food ran short, borders trembled. When borders trembled, supplies faltered again. The loop closed. Fast. Hattusa's gates did not fall because the system was simple. They fell because the system was complex, and its governors had to fight a storm on many fronts at once. There's honest uncertainty about exact weights. Climate, war, revolt, and economics blend in different measures across provinces, but the convergence is clear, and so is what followed. The empire died, its culture did not. Highly integrated states can buffer single shocks with law, ritual, and treaty. They struggle when shocks arrive together and feed each other. The Hittite case shows how codified order, even when sophisticated, can mask the fragility that comes from dependence on wide networks and clean succession. It also shows that political collapse and cultural disappearance are not the same story. Stand again before Hattusa's lion gate, the roadway empty, the stones warmed by afternoon light. The scribes are gone, but their tablets still speak. At Yazilikaya, a procession of gods still walks the cliff. Far to the south, Luwian signs on black basalt remember the line. The gates fell silent once. They kept an echo. Welcome to Mysteria Mundi.